Welcome to the recording of the Global Migration Center Roundtable, Refugees from Ukraine, the Legal and Policy Challenges of Protection, with Madeline Garlick, Chief Protection Policy and Legal Advice, UNHCR, Catherine Woollard, Director, European Council on Refugees and Exiles, Alicia Giraudel, Legal Advisor and Refugee Coordinator at Amnesty International Switzerland. The event was moderated by Professor Vincent Chetail. If you wish to keep informed about our activities, check out our website on graduateinstitute.ch/GMC or connect with us on Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn.
Good evening, everyone. Dear ladies, gentlemen, colleagues, friends and students, I'm very pleased to welcome you at the Graduate Institute for this new lecture organized by the Global Migration Center. For those who don't know about the center, the Global Migration Center is established here at the Graduate Institute and conducts advanced research and provides policy-oriented expertise it is considered as a center to establish also a link between the academic world and the Geneva International and the policy world. I'm Vincent, Professor of International Law here and also Director of the Global Migration Center and Board of the Directory. I'm Chair of the Directory Board of the Geneva Academy. And this roundtable is dedicated today to a particularly burning issue, namely refugees from Ukraine, and especially from the angle of the legal and policy challenges of protection. Today, more than 4.5 million of refugees have left from Ukraine in only 1 month and a half since after the military aggression of Russia. And this invasion has caused the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. And this current refugee crisis is clearly unique, especially when compared to previous crises, such as the one which happened in 2015 with the sudden arrival of refugees from Syria and Afghanistan in Europe. And at that time, in 2015, namely scholars, practitioners working in the field of refugee protection, we were used to say that in 2015, this was not a crisis of number for the EU. In reality, in 2015, the key countries of asylum were Turkey, Lebanon, and so on. In Europe, this was not a crisis of number. This was a crisis of solidarity. Today, here, the Ukrainian crisis is just the opposite, in the sense that this is a crisis of numbers, but not, for the time being at least, a crisis of solidarity. In fact, the Temporary Protection Directive was activated by the European Council with unanimous support of EU member states. And this is a quite unique endeavor because the Temporary Protection Directive was adopted more than 20 years ago in 2001 and was not implemented at all despite several calls. So clearly here, something has changed. Europe has quite suddenly rediscovered its tradition of hospitality, which is a very good thing as such. And the traditional rhetoric against migrants is now replaced by a discourse of protection. And this must be welcomed. This shift does not mean, however, that there are no challenges at all. On the contrary, of course, as in many situations of crisis, there are several challenges. Some issues, some challenges are specific to the reception of Ukrainian refugees in Europe, but other challenges are more general and highlight also the risk of double standards in Europe. And we have the chance today to discuss about the legal and policy challenges of protection. We have the chance today of having three experts. Dr. Madeline Garlick, Catherine Woollard, and Alicia Giraudel, who will share their views about the crisis, the refugee crisis in Ukraine, from Ukraine, and also the key challenges according to their own perspective, institutions, but also experience. I will start to give the floor to Madeline Garlick, who is a friend of the Graduate Institute. She is the chief of the Protection Policy and Legal Advice at the UN Refugee Agency, the UN High Commissioner, the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees. And she is working notably in the development and production of global guidance on the interpretation of refugee law. And she has, an extensive experience on the rights of refugees under international law, but also other displaced persons. She has worked, she was responsible for UNHCR liaison to the EU institution. So you know well also the specificities of the EU in this area. And she has served also with the UN in Iraq, Kenya, and many other places. I'm very pleased to give you the floor to share their views, and then we will continue the discussion with the other key experts who are online and will share their own views about this very specific, unique crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, and thanks really to the Graduate Institute for inviting me today, particularly to take part in this event and to share the platform with some of our key civil society partners, because the Ukraine situation, I think, certainly has demonstrated the crucial role that they play, both in operational and in advocacy terms. I'd like today to speak about three aspects of the Ukraine situation and the subsequent responses. Firstly, about the legal and standards and principles that are in play. Secondly, about some of the policy challenges, but also some of the very real practical aspects and challenges that we are seeing in terms of the implementation of the response. And thirdly, I'd like to look ahead then towards the future and ask what implications may emerge from this situation and what lessons might we draw. So first of all, then, to start on the question of the legal standards and principles. What is indeed very clear is that in response to this movement on a very exceptional scale, indeed the largest movement of refugees that we have seen in Europe since World War II at least, we have seen the European Union member states take a very exceptional measure in response. They've decided to apply the Temporary Protection Directive, a directive that was adopted in 2001, the first instrument, in fact, forming part of the common European asylum system that the EU established in the wake of the Amsterdam Treaty in 1999, which aimed to put in place a basis for common standards and for consistent EU-wide responses to refugee protection standards. I'll speak mainly about the EU today, but I should also note that, of course, we've had some important positive responses also with the grant of temporary protection arrangements in other European countries, including, and not least in Moldova, which is one of the non-EU member states bordering Ukraine, but also Norway and elsewhere. And we're going to hear from Alicia, I think, about Switzerland today. So with regards to the Temporary Protection Directive, this envisages, of course, the grant of refugee protection upon arrival of a form of refugee protection, a temporary protection, of defined categories of people from Ukraine without the need first to apply for asylum and undergo an individual assessment of their refugee protection needs. It's the first and only time that this directive has been used. And it's noteworthy also that this is an instrument that was envisaged for potential repeal in some of the proposals put forward by the European Commission a couple of years ago under the framework of the Pact on Asylum and Migration. But nonetheless, clearly it's come into its own with the Council's decision of the 4th of March to invoke it. The Temporary Protection Directive defines temporary protection as a procedure of exceptional character to provide, in the event of mass influx of displaced persons from third countries who are unable to return to their countries of origin, immediate and temporary protection. And this in particular if there is a risk that the asylum system of affected member states will be unable to process this influx without adverse effects. So this indeed was a situation that the EU member states unanimously, as Vincent pointed out, decided was applicable. And with the commencement of this arrangement, member states are obliged to grant temporary protection to several specific groups of people displaced on or after 24th of February. Firstly, Ukrainian nationals, together with their family members. Secondly, stateless persons and nationals of other countries than Ukraine who benefited from international protection or equivalent national protection in Ukraine and their family members. Among them, refugees recognised in Ukraine who fled the country during the crisis. But in addition, member states are required to apply either temporary protection under the directive or adequate protection under national law to an additional category, permanent residents of Ukraine who are unable to return to their countries of origin. And in addition, EU member states may apply temporary protection to stateless persons or other third country nationals residing legally in Ukraine who cannot return. So this last category focusing people who did not have permanent residence but some other legal right to stay. The directive foresees that a far-reaching set of entitlements accrues to people granted protection. A residence permit initially for 1 year, but with the potential for this to be extended for up to 3. The right to information about temporary protection and their entitlements. An unqualified right to work, very significant because this is a higher level of entitlement than asylum seekers in the EU otherwise are entitled to have when they first seek asylum. A right to accommodation or housing, social assistance, medical care, education for children, in some circumstances family reunification, access to the asylum procedure, and I'll return to that, and also very significantly the ability to move within the Union. And this has been particularly important. It also links to the fact that Ukrainians, at least under the cooperation agreement with the EU, have the right to move within the Union with it for up to 90 days. And this has enabled a large number of Ukrainians who have come across to spread out beyond the immediately neighbouring countries and to also go and join family or seek otherwise the means to stay in other EU member states. So as a matter of legal principle, what does UNHCR think of this? We're extremely positive. We find it extremely positive to see that this swift and generous mechanism has been used. It's difficult to imagine the sorts of challenges that we might have seen otherwise in seeking to facilitate the entry of over 4 million people to the immediately neighbouring countries if such a system had not been in place. HCR has long supported the use of swift, practical, group-based measures for the protection of refugees in situations where significant numbers arrive. We supported the adoption of the directive at the time in 2001 in the aftermath of the wars in the former Yugoslavia and also the response to movements of Kosovars through Europe at that time. One of the experiences based on which member states decided it was important to have a framework in place, a legal instrument that could regulate such a situation again in future. We've also issued guidance, recently updated in 2014, calling on states to make available temporary protection in situations where access to or decisions under an asylum procedure may not be feasible or possible. And we also have advocated for the use of prima facie refugee status determination arrangements in group situations in the past. But critically, from UNHCR's viewpoint, what is key and what is a part of the temporary protection framework is that the temporary protection grants are without prejudice to the rights of people to claim asylum if they need it at the end of the temporary protection period, if they have ongoing needs for protection from a risk, a well-founded fear of persecution that they might face otherwise if compelled to go back. So while it's a choice that the EU has taken to apply temporary protection in this situation, the right that is built in for people to apply for asylum if they need it at the end of this period reflects the binding obligation that EU member states have to ensure that people who do have such a well-founded fear of persecution will be able to get longer-term protection and access to a solution if they need it. It's been particularly noteworthy and positive to see that countries which have not necessarily been entirely supportive of international protection for refugees over recent years have been ready to step up and have not only signalled their readiness to see this far-reaching and generous EU framework applied, but have also been ready to activate their own national institutions to respond to the needs of Ukrainians arriving. We also think it's very significant to see the way that the EU institutions have stepped up and played a proactive role with the issuance of guidance by the European Commission on the application of temporary protection. We've seen the 10-point plan that has been issued by the European Council outlining a number of practical measures to be taken. The Commission has established a solidarity platform convening and seeking to coordinate all EU member state entities involved in the operational responses. So these are very positive aspects. But moving on to my second part, I'd also like to highlight that we do see, of course, in reality, some very significant implementation challenges which we hope can be overcome, but which need to be acknowledged and need to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Based on our experience and observations present in all of the countries receiving large numbers of arrivals with quick emergency deployments that we've made over recent weeks, we have observed that there are significant queues and backlogs, waiting times for appointments for people who are seeking to get the documentation they need to acknowledge their temporary protection status. We've seen people who have faced difficulties in proving their inability to return to their countries of origin, those in the second and third categories, notably, where sometimes the authorities that are charged with registering and issuing temporary protection are not in a position to assess whether this is in fact the case. We've seen some cases where insufficient information is available about rights, which is further challenged the ability of people fleeing Ukraine to take informed decisions about how to proceed. And we've also seen, in terms of the administrative measures that some states are taking, some gaps that are ongoing. In some countries, there's still no legislation which ensure access to the rights that people are entitled to. We have some legislation that has been passed which only recognises some of the categories of people enshrined in the Council's decisions. We've seen some countries which are also channeling some groups of those people who should be getting temporary protection up front into their asylum procedures. And in the case of a country like Hungary, where it's not possible as a matter of law to apply within the country, this is creating a very serious obstacle to access to long-term right to stay. By contrast, we've seen other countries that are taking some more generous approaches. Germany is already issuing 2-year residence permits to temporary protection holders. And very positively, we've seen that all countries are offering an immediate right to work. Some countries are doing better at providing the means to advise people on how to go about seeking work. Access to language classes and other things are also partial. So what this has signified to us is that there remains some significant challenges in stepping up and providing on the ground the means to enjoy access to the rights that the legal framework foresees. And this is noteworthy because, of course, some people have looked at the response and said, well, this is the European Union. It shouldn't be necessary for the UN to be there providing such support. But our observation is indeed that there are significant gaps and areas where we, with our experience in handling emergency situations and stepping up responses immediately, have been able to provide an important supportive and capacity development role. Perhaps 2 areas I'd highlight in particular in this regard, where we've really seen an urgent need and where we're seeking to work to support states in enhancing their capacity, relates to responses to gender-based violence. There are some people coming out of Ukraine who clearly have suffered gender-based violence as part of their experience in seeking to flee the conflict. And there simply aren't sufficient means in place to deal with people with their medical and psychological needs in many cases in some of the surrounding states. This is not a problem of lack of political will, but it is a gap in the response that needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Similarly, we have identified that there are significant risks that could be arising in the situation of exposure of people to the risks of trafficking in persons. Before this crisis erupted, what we knew was that there were significant problems around criminal actors that were operating in the region around Ukraine. And we are concerned that some of them may be taking advantage of the vulnerability of many people on the move, their need for transport, their need for lodging. And so what is also needing to be stepped up now is the vetting of all of those people who are coming forward, noting that there's been a very positive and generous response on the part of many citizens genuinely wishing to help, but nonetheless a clear need for checks to ensure that criminal elements aren't going to take advantage of this. So what do we foresee as some of the major questions around the future? Well, first and foremost, of course, it's going to be a question of how we're going to ensure that there are sustainable responses in place for as long as they are needed. What we don't see, of course, is any sign in the immediate near future that this conflict is going to abate. And even if it were to do so, the levels of destruction are going to mean that people are going to need to potentially seek and enjoy shelter in other countries for a significant time. It's noteworthy to see that although some of the pressure on the immediate countries surrounding Ukraine has been alleviated by the ability for people to move onward. We haven't seen until now activation of two provisions in the Temporary Protection Directive that are supposed to ensure that there is a systemic means of sharing responsibility amongst EU member states for this. Provisions that foresaw transfer of responsibility for beneficiaries of temporary protection if that were needed. This is something which in the past, in other situations, has proven sensitive. When efforts were made in the aftermath of large-scale arrivals of 2015 to ensure transfers of new arrivals from Greece and Italy in particular, this was a matter that proved impossible to implement swiftly and in large numbers to address the needs, partly because of the lack of readiness on the part of member states to step up and implement it effectively. This might be needed in the future, and if it's the case, it's going to be a real test for the solidarity principle, which is certainly a key one to which the EU is committed on paper, but which may need significantly more efforts in practice to ensure that needs are addressed. So what's this going to mean otherwise for protection in Europe in the longer term? I think what we can see is at least 3 and possibly more potential scenarios that could be envisaged. What we hope is that this could lead to a reinvigorated approach to asylum and the grant of protection to people who need it within the European Union. After some years where we've seen some much more restrictive and less welcoming approaches to refugees from many other situations worldwide, what we hope is that the positive response that we've seen now signals a recognition in the European Union of the crucial role that refugee protection plays in the multilateral framework and in very practical responses to protection needs of people who are forced to flee, based amongst other things, reflecting in many ways the principles of the Global Compact on Refugees adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2018. What is another less positive scenario is that it would be if we were to see that in the months to come there would be a degree of asylum fatigue sets in, that after the initial generous response it's found that Ukrainians are placing more strain on local services and that perhaps the generous response we see now begins to lose some of its luster. We already hear that there are some situations in which local communities are asking questions about whether or not they're going to also be able to continue to host these people in significant numbers, or whether this is going to mean less opportunities for them to enjoy high standards of medical care, of education for children and other facilities. We hope that this can be addressed, and as I've said, a comprehensive look at what's really needed to ensure solidarity for receiving countries may be part of what's needed further down the line. A further scenario that we need to be about which we would need to be very cautious is one in which this proved to be a situation that is exceptional and treatment reserved for a group of European refugees arriving on Europe's doorstep that did not result in more reinforced recognition of the importance of protection principles for other groups of refugees worldwide. Even though this is a very significant number of refugees, we still have over 26 million refugees worldwide, 86% of whom, of course, are hosted in the poorest regions of the world. So Europe is certainly a region that is not hosting the vast majority of people in need of protection. And what we have sought to make clear in the responses in recent weeks, of course, is that refugee protection has amongst one of its core principles the principle of non-discrimination. One of the positive things that we have heard over the last few weeks is recognition on the part of the European Commission, and at least one public event that I have attended, that this response now represents a response that's informed by some of the lessons learned from 2015. The Commissioner for Home Affairs actually admitted outright that 2015 saw many mistakes on the part of the European Union, and that the failure to apply the Temporary Protection Directive, therefore, perhaps in other situations might be seen as a failure to recognise its value and potential worth and the need to invoke it in situations such as this, something that we hope will be a lesson taken on board now. So we're working on the most positive scenario from UNHCR's viewpoint, and we'll continue to underline the need to work towards this in our conversations with concerned states and institutions. And we hope that all of the partners working in this area are also going to be encouraging the European Union to take this longer and wider and more global view. I found a quote today that was attributed to the former High Commissioner for Refugees, now Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Guterres, addressing the Justice and Home Affairs Council back in 2015 at one of its crisis meetings, as large numbers, 1 million, seems relatively small now, people were arriving at Europe at that time. And he told the Home Affairs ministers there that, and I quote, "We can't deter people fleeing for their lives. They will come. The choice we have is how well we manage their arrival and how humanely." And I think the events of these last weeks really bear that out. What we've seen is a good and positive choice that's been made. Let's hope that the European Union's choice is going to continue to be generous and positive in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And clearly, we all hope that this shift in the EU policy will continue in the future, and this is not just an exception in a long history of refoulement and exclusion. The important things which can be highlighted also is that with such a shift, now there is also, a clear conviction also among observers and NGOs to make sure that what is done for Ukrainian refugees will be done for other refugees, because clearly here we can see more and more reports from NGOs denouncing double standards, but not only in order to make sure that refugee protection is granted on a universal basis and a non-discriminatory basis. And interestingly, not only NGOs, but also the Council of Europe has published last week a report explaining that refoulement at land borders must stop, and that protection, the EU must give protection alongside the good practice it has developed with in the context of the Ukrainian protection. So clearly, there is a room, or at least a momentum, for all stakeholders also to highlight that a positive approach is possible and in line not only with the tradition, the values of the EU, but in line with its duties under international law. And I'm very pleased to continue this dialogue with Catherine Woollard, who is the director of a major NGO working in this area, the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, a very important and influential NGOs, providing very interesting and I must say, as a scholar, a very solid legal commentary on EU legislation, on international refugee law. And I'm very pleased today to have Catherine Boulard as the director of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, a position she has held since 2016. And previously, she was the executive director of the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office, a Brussels-based network working on conflict prevention and security. So clearly, victims of armed conflicts are also a key concern in the professional life of Catherine Woollard. And clearly, here, there are a lot to say from the angle of your organization, the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. And I'm very pleased to give you the floor to share your views and expertise about the use of the Temporary Protection Directive, but also the challenges you have witnessed within your organizations. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Just sorry that I can't be with you all there in the room, maybe for next time. So my comments are going to cover three separate sections. First of all, the immediate challenges that are being faced as a result of this displacement from Ukraine. Second, medium-term challenges. And then thirdly, some recommendations and suggestions about how to try to tackle some of those challenges, or indeed prevent them from arising. I base my comments on information that we receive from our members in all the affected countries and in Ukraine, where people are still trying to work in different ways, and also from our work here in Brussels and the discussions that we have here. So first point, immediate challenges. And as has been well described already. What we're dealing with right now is a humanitarian emergency, level 3, as declared by UNHCR. I think many of the immediate challenges are typical of any humanitarian emergency which leads to heavy displacement. So things like fundraising, bringing in funding, absorbing funding, putting in place staffing, logistics, coordination, risk of exploitation, local versus international response, trying to maintain grand bargain, which is, as usual, impossible. Then in Ukraine itself, of course, protection in the most basic sense is the key challenge, minimizing civilian casualties, and this kind of futile attempt to argue for respect for international humanitarian law, and unfortunately typical of contemporary armed conflict, that there is deliberate targeting of civilians, including the many IDPs remaining within the country. And we also see that the displacement response is combined with international criminal justice response from the start, which is something that can pose problems because that involves documentation, preservation of evidence up to criminal standards, attempts to avoid the so-called contamination of victims and witnesses, all of which may intrude into a refugee response. Not that, of course, it's not crucially important that this justice element is there. I think one difference here is that this war results from invasion, and that's actually quite unusual. Conflict and armed violence nowadays is more likely to be secessionist rather than irredentist. The meaning of that for displacement is that majority of the men in the country are fighting, and that fact of the cause of the conflict, the invasion, is one of the main factors leading to this particular composition of the displaced population as 80% women and children. And this in turn increases the risk of exploitation and the vulnerability compared to other situations. Of course, the many particularities of every displacement context, but I think that's worth mentioning. And in the neighbouring countries, the EU member states receiving people, and in Moldova, there's challenges, of course, linked to providing basic needs, shelter, food, healthcare, etc. And the sheer numbers make this difficult. I would also note that there is also a particular challenge here because, of course, the response is led by the states, as we would expect in a humanitarian emergency in Europe. And we know already that certain EU member states have limited institutional capacity, and that may be weaker than one would expect given the sort of wealth of the continent. So I think that in every sense, there's great variety when we look at the member states responding. Pulling in the other direction is the great advantage of the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive. And as Madeline has explained, this covers the vast majority of people who have fled, means that they don't have to seek asylum, although they are able to should they wish to do so. And that means that some of the challenges then become practical ones of registration, questions of validity of documents, and arranging onward movement. There are, of course, questions of eligibility for the temporary protection status for particular groups, certain undocumented people, stateless people, and for certain categories of third country nationals present in Ukraine. For civil society, the immediate challenges people are facing are very similar to those described by UNHCR. I mean, everybody is scrambling to respond to the scale of displacement. I would note, though, in some of the countries most affected, civil society has been under attack from their own governments for a number of years. It's been significantly weakened, with reduced resources, reduced staffing, and in some cases also squeezed out of formal processes, such as service provision for reception, integration, but also things like legal aid provision systems where NGOs have been pushed out where they're in a sort of tense relationship with states, which is a number of the countries involved. this adds to the difficulty in responding. In many cases, NGOs are needing to scale up rapidly, and they're not always able to do that. And then we also have the dynamic that means that it may be international NGOs as well as international organisations that are coming in to respond, creating certain tension. And let me move on to the medium-term challenges, my second point. If we take a perspective from now up until the end of the year, the course of the war is highly unpredictable, and this also means that the pattern of displacement is also unpredictable. However, I would agree with the UNHCR perspective. It seems likely that there will be large numbers of refugees outside the country, large numbers of IDPs up until the end of the year, at least. Of course, we have more positive scenarios where fighting ceases and people are able to return, or more negative scenarios which see continued violence, regrouping of Russian forces, additional external support to Russia, and potentially years of high intensity or mid-intensity violence. So if we take a midway scenario, displacement of millions until the end of the year, we would say there are 5 interlinked challenges. 1, the move from short-term emergency response to long-term structural support for the refugees. 2nd, maintaining popular and political support. 3rd, maintaining unity within Europe. 4th, a more even and fairer geographic distribution of the people displaced across Europe and beyond Europe. And 5th, mitigating potential damaging effects on the wider asylum system. So with my final point, I'll just conclude by putting forward some of our recommendations and suggestions for trying to tackle those 5 challenges that we're looking at for the midterm, being the period up until the end of the year approximately. The first of these, the move to long-term structural support, is made a lot easier by the activation of the TPD. At the same time, it's made a lot more difficult because of the numbers, but the TPD is a crucial tool. The vast majority of the people who have fled have immediate protection, so they won't be tied up in asylum systems for years. So the focus now shifts to questions of implementation of the TPD. Part of that is on the registration. It's really just a practical challenge. We're urging deployment of the EU Asylum Agency, use of EU funds, even involvement of other actors at the registration level. And I think there may actually be interesting experience from Turkey on this, where one of our Turkish members at one point was registering 2,000 people per day under the Turkish temporary protection regime. And then information and qualification questions. There may be particular challenges for third country nationals. So I have to tell you, I have a canary in my office which is now singing. So if you hear this in the background, it's not because I have a soundtrack on. It's an attention seeking. With this question of making sure that everybody who's entitled gets this protection status, in the end, I think this is likely to go to litigation. I mean, there's one level which will be interpretation of the TPD. There's a number of phrases in there. There's a number of things that are quite unclear and that where we need probably courts to interpret. And then at some points, this is going to lead to legal cases. We're already receiving requests and starting to map. But then the main question of TPD implementation is the content of protection. This is largely positive. It's a full set of rights. But this means applying the principle of integration from day one, massive mobilization of integration actors, whole of government approach with different ministries, agencies, civil societies, and then possibly also legal cases on socio and economic rights. Maintaining popular support, I think, is crucial, depends on continued clever involvement of people and communities, and those who know how to manage volunteers, I think, will play a crucial role. And political unity as one of the challenges. In our view, or in my view, I should say, perhaps, this requires rather action on the diplomatic and security side. The reason we have unity on the refugee response is a result of security and military considerations. There may be differences emerging when it comes to peace settlements that aren't apparent at this point of open conflict. Fourth, penultimate challenge and the response or recommendation: even and fairer geographic distribution of people across Europe and beyond. This is crucial, I think. People need to move on because countries will not be able to manage, and there may then be a loss of popular or political support, particularly Poland, but we would also underline Romania, Austria, Czech Republic, Estonia as countries at risk here. One of the issues is that certain countries are not requesting support, and the argument is that they're not doing this for the wrong reasons, because they don't want to be seen to need solidarity or to rely on solidarity, because this plays into the wider political debate on solidarity. There's also the issue that the people themselves don't want to move on, which is understandable. People want to stay close to the borders. And so more can be done to encourage, invite and facilitate movement, but it may need to go beyond this, ensuring and reassuring people about the prospects of return. And if we have a situation, for instance, where Canada is offering unlimited places for Ukrainian refugees, not taking advantage of that is, of course, a problem, but we can understand the psychology of not wanting to be so far away. And my final point here, the final challenge is mitigating the damaging effects on the wider asylum system. So I think there is a major risk here. Implementation gaps already involved limited or inadequate reception capacity, denial of access at borders, impunity for violations. These things may be exacerbated. Staff may be redeployed to be working on TPD implementation, and asylum systems under-resourced and slowing down. So this needs monitoring, advocacy, litigation, mobilisation of other communities. We would also argue that there needs to be a rethinking of the legislative proposals that have been put forward for the Common European Asylum System. The 2016 reforms such as Remain, the Pact, and the new mini package on instrumentalisation. All these proposals go in the exact opposite direction of this response to the crisis. They reduce standards, but they also create rules that are impractical, inefficient, and unworkable. Here we see a response that is based on the EU managing, because the decision has been taken to manage, attempts to minimise crisis rhetoric and panic, not to stoke and generate and exploit the crisis debate, the EU active, visible, seeking a strong role, and an approach based on getting people protection as quickly as possible, on allowing family reunion, and on allowing and indeed encouraging onward movement. And this is in the TPD, but it's also in the guidance from the EU institutions, whereas the proposals are based on reducing prospects for protection, containment at the borders, and do nothing to tackle the failure of family reunification or other compliance problems. So in our view, the whole lot should be withdrawn, but to be more realistic, the worst elements should at least be withdrawn. So for instance, the proposal to repeal the TPD, the instrumentalisation package, the APR, and then move to applying what has been learned here, the value of rapid triggering of the TPD, hopefully good experience on integration from day one will follow, how to mobilise EU funding, and the need for asylum systems to be functioning generally in order to scale up and add capacity, and focusing on compliance, not on unnecessary reforms. So this would, we hope, be a way to generate wider benefits for all refugees from this positive response. rather than it being a positive response only for Ukraine, or even worse, the positive response to Ukraine being combined with an even more negative response to others and a deterioration in the asylum systems. So this is an advocacy, I would say an advocacy, litigation and communications challenge to try to ensure wider benefits. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And clearly, no, this is a key challenge. I mean, to build on the positive decision taken by the EU to protect Ukrainian refugees and to make sure that this will be on a long-term basis, first of all, but also on an inclusive basis to make sure that it is not based on purely political or even worse racial considerations. And clearly the popular support is key here, as you rightly mentioned, because what is very intriguing in this particular crisis is also the open political support towards refugees, which is a major, unfortunately, a major change when compared to past crises. And here, also, not only the political support, but also the popular support in the sense. And this can create a momentum in favor of a more open, evidence-based narrative. Because what has been the key problem, besides many other aspects, was for a long period of time the rhetoric against the refugees. And here there is a key change as such. And clearly, limiting this positive rhetoric to Ukrainian refugees is not possible. It is not acceptable. It is not possible. And this is simply illegal because it will be racist. So clearly, there is here the possibility to move and to build on this positive development in order to enlarge this positive narrative, this new narrative, whereby refugees are no longer terrorist economic migrants, but they are victims, and they are accordingly in need of protection. And this is a major shift also in the political rhetoric today, and maybe a key opportunity to develop a more inclusive asylum policy. I would like to continue the discussions with Alicia Giraudel. Alicia Giraudel is the legal advisor and refugee coordinator at Amnesty International Switzerland, where she is currently responsible for refugee advocacy, strategic litigations, and research on human rights violations. Previously, she worked as a human rights officer at the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva and Ecuador, but also legal officer at the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she has been involved notably in the negotiation process of the two global compact on refugees and migrants. And I must add also she is a previous student of the Graduate Institute. I mean, this is not the reason why she's here, of course, but I mean, this is important for students here in this in the room. And I'm very pleased to have you and to Alicia, and to have your expertise and views also about the situation in Switzerland. Switzerland has been very open, as many other European states, and has established a specific status for Ukrainian refugees. But of course, there are also many legal and practical challenges regarding the reception of Ukrainian refugees in Switzerland. So I would be very pleased to have your views and expertise on the refugees from Ukraine, and also your views on the situation in Switzerland.
Thank you, Vincent. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure to be back at the Institute as an alumni, former student of yours. And so I will try to not repeat too much that has already been said, because I think it was very comprehensive what has been said by the former speakers. However, I think there are particularities to Switzerland that should be raised, and especially so I'm going to focus on 3 points. The first point is the legal challenges, and actually I try to draw a short comparison of the European and the Swiss legal regimes, which do differ a little bit, and then I'll speak a little bit about the Swiss politics and the general public and media rhetoric and narrative. And in the end, I'm just going to shortly address the question of the double standards that has already been mentioned, and how it concretely impacts other asylum seekers. The last point is really important to me, because I do work directly with refugees and asylum seekers, and I do hear a lot about how they feel about the situation. So yeah, I'll just try to give you a little overview and be brief. So after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, the Federal Council reacted very quickly and actually very pragmatically for once. It announced immediately that the refugees from Ukraine were going to be accepted, and all actors involved agreed on what needed to be done and to support the refugees, and they have actually been working together since. So the refugees were allowed immediately to enter the country, even without the identity documents that would otherwise be required. And Switzerland has not adopted the Temporary Protection Directive. However, there's another temporary protection regime, the so-called S status, that was created in 1998 after the wars in ex-Yugoslavia, and that was activated for the first time in history. And it was applied in a more generous manner than originally foreseen by the law. That happened actually thanks to the pressure from the UNHCR and the civil society organizations. So now persons that are fleeing Ukraine are allowed to travel in the Schengen area without restrictions and to work immediately without a 3 months waiting period, and they can immediately join their family. And furthermore, the definition of the group of persons in need of protection was interpreted more extensively than provided by the law. So this is actually very similar to what happened with the TP, the Temporary Protection Directive. So in concrete terms, it's the protection status means that persons can receive protection in Switzerland without having to undergo an asylum procedure. It's a very simplified procedure, and the S permit is limited to 1 year, and it is renewable. And after 5 years at the earliest, persons in need of protection receive a residence permit. However, it is limited in time until the temporary protection is lifted. So as I said, there are differences between the status S and the temporary directive. And this could actually also bring disadvantages for people from Ukraine who are staying in Switzerland, and in comparison to those who are staying in EU states. So the first point is that the EU directive protects the right of every person to seek protection, who seeks protection to file an asylum claim. However, in Switzerland, it is not clear how the relation between the asylum procedure and the S status will be handled. The law seems to provide that the asylum procedure will only be conducted in cases where it is obvious that a person in need of protection is a refugee. We do not really know what that means yet. When do they consider that it is obvious? But in all other cases, this S status will be granted and the asylum procedure is suspended, and it can only be resumed after 5 years. So this is definitely a point that is problematic and that has to be looked at. And furthermore, it's not clear yet how Switzerland will interact with other EU member states. So people from Ukraine who are seeking protection could potentially be transferred back to other EU states if they received temporary protection in these states, and come to Switzerland later. So Switzerland could decide to refuse an admission under the S status based on an already existing EU protection. Furthermore, something that is very unsettling is that the social assistance for the S status is far below the level of social assistance offered to Swiss nationals and also recognized refugees. And this means, for instance, in certain cantons like Argovia, people would only receive 2 francs per day for a lunch. Which is totally impossible. And then there's also an important point which I'd like to raise, is that the Federal Council has the possibility of extending the protection status as, which is, as I mentioned, limited to 1 year, but it's still a resident. It's only a temporary protection, and we in Switzerland have the experience that we should that people who receive temporary protection, like Syrians, Afghans, they mostly stay longer, and they have a very precarious situation because of their status. So it would be really important to ask ourselves whether it's realistic to expect people to return in a few years, and if it could influence how Ukrainians or people fleeing Ukraine will feel if they are only granted the S permit. So yeah, this is also a very important point, and all the legal questions that I've just mentioned, I think, have to be addressed in the coming months, and it will hopefully be solved in a manner that is compatible with international law and will give persons fleeing Ukraine a feeling of safety and stability. So as I said, the policy challenge, there are also some policy challenges, especially Swiss politics. I believe some of the students who know Switzerland a little bit already know what I'm talking about. You must say, I mean, this is very similar to other countries, but in Switzerland, it's almost unprecedented to have so many resources mobilized and to experience such strong solidarity. The civil society involvement is enormous. We have 45,000 private housing offers that had been posted in the database of Swiss aid organizations in mid-March, so only a few weeks after the war started. And even right-wing parties have changed their rhetoric and the discourse completely. Just to give you a little reminder, in 2000, when there was an increasing number of West Africans that applied for asylum, the mantra of the right-wing party was dangerous refugees are coming. And then in 2011, with the Arab Spring, this mantra changed to all these fake refugees are coming. And finally, in 2015, when nearly 40,000 people sought protection in Switzerland, so many from Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq, the conservative parties complained that there were too many refugees in Switzerland. So they have actually put so many efforts over the last decades in tightening the Swiss asylum law and closing the European borders that it's very, very surprising to see their support in this new crisis. So even though there are great efforts from politicians and the population, and it has to be welcomed, it is very difficult to ignore that there is a double standard in Swiss refugee policy. This, just to give you some numbers, you have to ask yourself, why is it possible that 28,515 Ukrainians were registered in Switzerland until yesterday in a few weeks, and 24,389 have already obtained the S status, while for a long time people were waiting for up to 5 years to just receive an F status, which is a temporary protection, gives you very few rights. When you compare it to what happened last summer, where the Swiss migration authorities were still convinced that that deportations to Afghanistan were possible, and they only at the end of 2021, they have only resettled 78 Afghans. 380 Afghans were evacuated, and only 37 Afghans received a humanitarian visa for Switzerland. And so there are some, I mean, it's not surprising that some asylum seekers are having nagging thoughts and try to understand why wasn't this possible for us? And does this also have to do with the fact that Ukrainians look different than us, or look more European? So these are the kind of questions that people ask me directly when I'm in contact with them, and so they cannot help but think that there is a hierarchy between people searching for protection. And when you look at the rhetoric, some differences, I mean, are easy to explain. For example, even before the war, Ukrainian citizens could move around the Schengen area without a visa for 90 days. But beyond that, Ukrainian refugees are allowed many things that others are denied. For instance, other asylum seekers or people who have a temporary status, like Syrians and Afghans, they can take public transport for free of charge and receive free SIM cards. And also, thanks to the protection status S, they can take up a job or start their own business on the day of their arrival. Students of Ukraine, from Ukrainian universities from any background can transfer to Swiss universities, and they do not have to pay fees and receive scholarships. They enjoy full freedom of movement and have a right to apply for family reunification. And something interesting is also that because of the arrival of the Ukrainians, the very criticized practice of seizing valuables from refugees when they enter an asylum center was suddenly abolished. Also, we have been pushing the authorities for years to abolish this practice because it was against the right to privacy. And so it seems that whether refugees are welcome in Switzerland or not depends on a lot of factors. And if you look at the media reports, they often refer to the cultural and physical closeness, the type of conflict, or the common enemy to justify the increased empathy. But it looks like the perception of a certain group of refugees plays an important role. So where they come from, how well known the conflict situation is they are fleeing, and how the media report on the situation of these people in their home country is. So this is also where me as a Swiss citizen, I'm asking myself, how is there is between the commitment to the Swiss humanitarian tradition, there's a big contrast with the respective foreign and domestic political circumstances. And from the point of view of the refugees, it's obvious that it does not matter whether the war they are fleeing is a war of aggression or civil war. The danger to life and limb is the same, and the refugees need protection, accommodation, and a perspective as long as they cannot return. And that should also apply to anyone who's fleeing from wars or civil war, be it from Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, or any other country. So just to finish up, I think this conflict shows us that Europe, and including Switzerland, as one of the richest blocs in the world, is more than capable of receiving large numbers of refugees who are fleeing violence, something which it has failed on previous occasions to do. And the empathy that is being shown to Ukrainians is great, but it should be shown to all refugee groups who are equally deserving of our compassion and of our assistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alicia. And yes, indeed, Switzerland is not an exception following your description, in the sense that there is a popular support, and such a popular support is also a key change when compared to the past political context. And clearly, this is arguably the same reality of many other European states. And here is probably the key source of hope in the way that this crisis has established a new rhetoric, a new narrative, and we will see if this will also transform the practice and the politics of refugee protection. this is difficult. I mean, to know exactly where what will happen. Of course, unfortunately, the story is more or less the same in situation of conflict. Refugees are used to think that they will return soon. It was exactly the same story in Syria at the beginning of the conflict, and in many other conflicts. Of course, we all hope that this horrible war will finish as soon as possible. But based on the experience of past conflicts, it may happen that this situation will be on a long term, and accordingly, here the popular support will be also key to make sure that this is not just for a short period of time. And probably here also the Refugee Convention has a role to play, in the sense that the Temporary Protection Directive is clearly a good thing given the situations and the circumstances. However, this must not be used as an obstacle to the refugee protection, because clearly the possibility of giving 2 years residence permit under the temporary protection is welcome, but at some point they are also all entitled to the refugee status on a long-term basis. So clearly, it's difficult to predict what will happen, but of course, temporary protection must remain temporary and should not be used as a way to undermine the refugee convention as such. It's true, it's difficult to know what will happen. And it's also true, I remember Guy Goodwin Gill, a famous authority in refugee law, who told me a long time ago, 1 or 2 decades ago, we refugee lawyers are used to be paranoid because the problem is that every time there is something new from the state practice, we are thinking that there is something wrong. And clearly, for once, I mean, this is a positive decision, but given our professional experience in this area, we still need to have more time to make sure that this will be a truly positive shift and policy in this area. The good news is, of course, that victims of war in Ukraine are protected, are recognized as victims, and are recognized as refugees. The next step, if unfortunately the war will continue, is to make sure that this protection will continue and the full rights will be granted to them. I would like to thank you warmly to Madeline, Alicia, and Catherine for being here with us today to share your views. It was very interesting, and I would like to thank you for your, of course, your involvement in refugee protection since a long period of time, but also your dedication and involvement in this particular roundtable.